We are at the decade of 1940, and this is the decade when World War II was fought. This is a war that was especially notable for the extent to which civilians became the targets of killing. Initially, people in the United States were horrified by the tactics used by Japan and Germany that targeted civilians. But eventually, the United States would resort to using these tactics to win the war. So, at the beginning of this decade, Hitler continues to lead Nazi Germany in taking over territory in Europe, and Hitler looks unstoppable. He defeats most of Europe, including France, and in 1941, Hitler begins bombing London. That is, he begins dropping bombs on a large city for the purpose of killing civilians with the hopes it will force Britain to surrender. The picture on the screen is a picture of London shortly after one of these bombings. And Britain is the last European holdout that has not yet fallen to Hitler and to the Nazis in Germany. And so Britain desperately pleads with the United States to enter the war and help. But at this point, people in the United States do not want to get involved in what they view as Europe's war. And then in 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. So now, at this point, Germany has control over most of Europe. It is attacking Britain on one front, and it is attacking the Soviet Union on another front. Also in 1941, Japan expanded its conquest of China, and Japan took over an area called French Indochina, which is the purple area down here on the map. And this is the area that is currently the country of Vietnam, and events taking place here during the 1940s would set the stage for the future Vietnam War that would embroil the United States a few decades later. So French Indochina was a French colony, that is, it was an area under the control of France. However, when France was defeated by Germany, France lost control of French Indochina. So then Japan took advantage of this power vacuum, and Japan invaded Indochina. Also, recall that Japan already had control of the area called Manchuria, which would be the yellow area up there on the map. And recall that in 1938, Japan had invaded the Chinese city of Nanjing and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in a massacre. Here's Nanjing on the map. I'll circle it there. So Japan was looking more and more dangerous in its quest for power. And people in the United States were worried about Japan's aggression, but they didn't want to take military action. So the United States placed an embargo on Japan. And recall that the United States had gained control of the Philippine Islands after the Spanish-American War. Here, the Philippines Islands are right down there on the map. And so this meant that the United States was in a position to enforce that embargo because it was relatively nearby to Japan. And the result of this is that it deprived Japan of access to the oil that it desperately needed to continue its military operations. Now, notably, during the previous decade, the United States had not been spending very much money on its military, whereas Japan had been investing heavily in its military. So even though the United States was a much larger country than Japan, in 1941 the two countries had navies that were about equal in size and strength. And so in trying to figure out what to do about the embargo, Japanese military planners projected that a large, quick, devastating military strike on the United States Navy could make the United States surrender. However, these military planners also realized that the United States had much greater industrial resources. And so for Japan to win a war, it would need to do so quickly before the United States could activate its industrial potential. So, on December 7th, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, a harbor on Hawaii where a large portion of ships for the U.S. Navy were docked. And then, shortly after that, Germany also declared war on the United States. And so now, this meant the United States was involved in World War II. This meant that the United States was now fighting two wars, one against Japan and one against Germany. Fortunately, the United States was able to hold out long enough to build up its industrial potential, producing aircraft carriers, planes, tanks, and weapons. An important turning point in the war was on June 6, 1944, a day typically known as D-Day. So this was after almost 3 years of fighting since the United States first entered the war. And on this day, over 150,000 British and American and Canadian troops crossed the English Channel from Britain to France. And fighting on the beaches where they landed was fierce, and more than 4,000 of these soldiers were killed. However, the Allies were able to gain a foothold in France, and this allowed them to begin a process of fighting back the German army. It was also around this time that the United States and Britain began firebombing. Just as Germany and Japan had used tactics intended to kill large numbers of civilians, now the United States and Britain began resorting to similar horrific tactics. Specifically, firebombing involved dropping incendiary bombs on highly populated cities. The bombs were designed to ignite buildings on fire and to create massive firestorms. One example is that the United States and Britain bombed the city of Dresden in February of 1945. The firestorm was so great that people were killed both by the fire and by suffocation because the fire used up so much oxygen. One estimate is that 25,000 people were killed in Dresden. On the screen is a picture of the devastation in Dresden after the firebombing. So, as the United States and Britain fought Germany, the Soviet Union also continued to fight Germany, and in April 1945, the Soviet Union reached the city of Berlin, and at that point, Hitler committed suicide, and the war with Germany was finally over. Although the war with Germany ended in April, the war with Japan continued, and continued in spite of the fact that at this point the United States had assembled such a powerful military, and Japan had lost so many men and airplanes and ships that Japan had no chance of winning. But Japanese military promoted a culture where it was considered dishonorable to surrender and honorable to fight to the death. And Japan resorted to taking young, untrained men called kamikaze pilots and placing them in airplanes to fly suicide missions in which they would attempt to fly their planes into United States aircraft carriers. It was becoming clear that although the United States had more than enough military strength to win the war, thousands of soldiers, thousands of people would be killed in the process. However, the United States had a new weapon. For many years, the United States had a secret program codenamed the Manhattan Project, where scientists worked on developing an atomic bomb. Much of the work was carried out at the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico under the direction of a nuclear physicist named Robert Oppenheimer. So, in the summer of 1945, At that point, actually, Harry Truman had just taken over as president because Franklin Roosevelt died in office just a few months prior. So Harry Truman had just taken over as president, and at that point, the Manhattan Project completed work in developing an atomic bomb, and Truman instructed the military to proceed with plans to use it. So on August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima in Japan. About 5 square miles of the city were leveled. About 80,000 people were killed instantly, and thousands more would die later from radiation exposure. Then, given that Japan did not immediately surrender, the United States dropped a second, even larger bomb on the city of Nagasaki. And at that point, Japan surrendered, and the war was finally over. After the war, the extent of the Nazi Holocaust against Jewish people became fully apparent. Hitler conducted a massive genocide, killing millions of Jewish people. Throughout the war, the Nazis tried different methods for killing Jewish people, and eventually Jewish people were packed into freight trains and taken to horrendous, crowded, filthy concentration camps, and they were killed in large gas chambers. And one of the more sobering thoughts regarding the Holocaust is the fact that it was driven by ideas of Nordic superiority and ideas associated with eugenics. These are some of the same ideas that were popular among academics and among psychologists in the United States prior to the war. Notably, the tragedy of the Holocaust made it clear how ideas regarding eugenics could be terrible and dangerous. And although racist ideas continued to thrive in the United States, ideas specifically about eugenics quickly fell out of favor. So academic people began to disavow eugenics. Something that had been a popular part of psychology was quickly forgotten and swept under the rug. The decade of 1940 saw new developments in medical treatments for people with mental disorders. One of these new treatments was a type of crude, brutal brain surgery called the lobotomy. The story of lobotomies is a tragic story. It is also a story that illustrates the importance of statistics and data analysis. Recall that at this point in history, there had been several recent innovations in statistics. Spearman had developed formulas that could be used for evaluating reliability and validity of assessment instruments. Fisher had highlighted the importance of random assignment and described procedures for conducting experiments. Fisher and Gossett had developed formulas for estimating sampling error, and researchers could use p-values to guide their decisions about whether or not they should claim to have discovered something. However, at this point in history, these techniques were still relatively new. They were not yet widely used. So, as I tell the story of lobotomies, an important thing to notice is that none of these new statistical techniques would be used to evaluate the effects of lobotomies. If they had been used, it might have prevented this tragedy. The mistakes that were made in the story of lobotomies are the mistakes that the new statistical techniques were designed to address. So, our story of lobotomies begins with a man named Igaz Moniz. And Moniz was a prominent medical doctor in Portugal. And notably, he was also politically active. After the very First World War, he served as Portugal's representative to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Now, our story actually begins in the previous decade, in 1935. And in 1935, Moniz traveled to London to attend a conference. And at this conference, Moniz heard a presentation by a man named John Fulton discussing experiments conducted on chimpanzees. And in these experiments, researchers cut lesions in the frontal lobes of the chimpanzees' brains, and then afterwards, these researchers observed that the animals seemed difficult to agitate. So, building on this report, Moniz developed a theory that many types of mental illness are caused by thoughts getting fixed in repetitive loops in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And he thought that we could effectively treat mental illness if we could break these loops. His idea was that if we could sever connections between some of the neurons in the frontal lobes, it might break the loops and prove to be an effective treatment. Initially, he called this procedure leucotomy, and it involved drilling holes in the skull and inserting an instrument called a leucotome into the brain and then twisting it around. A picture of a leucotome is depicted on the top of the screen. So, shortly after hearing about the studies with chimpanzees, Moniz tested his leucotomy procedure on 20 human patients. And he reported impressive results. He reported that 7 had completely recovered, and 7 had improved, and 6 were unchanged, and he reported that no one got worse. Notably, several years later, in 1949, Moniz actually received a Nobel Prize for his discovery of the leucotomy. Although, in retrospect, this may have been more of a tragedy than an important discovery. In retrospect, we now know that this procedure was a dangerous procedure that caused harmful long-term brain damage in patients. By cutting lesions in patients' frontal lobes, the procedure caused patients to lose their ability to plan ahead. They lost initiative, they became apathetic, and they had problems with inhibition, and they displayed what was sometimes described as a mental dullness. Many people became unable to care for themselves, and then they lived in institutions for the rest of their lives. Occasionally, the procedure caused patients to have seizures or to become paralyzed, and in some cases, patients died from complications. So, how is it that this early research came to such a wrong conclusion? If lobotomies were such a tragedy, how did Moniz come to the conclusion that they helped people with mental disorders? At one point, I looked to see if I could find a translation of Moniz's original 1935 article, and I could not find one. However, I did find a translation of an article he published just a few years later, in 1937, reporting 3 additional cases. Here is an excerpt from that article. The article essentially provides a narrative account of 3 patients who were given leucotomies. It describes their symptoms before the procedure and describes what they were like afterwards. So the excerpt on the screen is from the description of the first of these 3 cases, from case 1. So as you can see, it says BVJ is a female. She's 36 years old, she was depressed, she had a history of suicide attempts, and she was suffering from paranoid delusions. And the report says, after receiving the leucotomy, on the 12th day, she said she felt well. She said, "It's all over. I've been locked up now for 5.5 years, but I wasn't crazy. I want to go back and live with my daughters." And they report that they found that she was in good condition, although possibly a little reticent, and they report that the family found her in excellent condition, just as she had been before the psychosis. And so she left the hospital now, and after 6 months, she remains in entirely normal condition. So that certainly is an impressive report. So what were the problems with this study? Now, aside from the obvious ethical problems of testing a wildly experimental type of brain surgery on people, the most obvious and biggest problem with the report we just looked at is that it was simply a subjective narrative. Nothing had been quantified. That is, nothing had been turned into numerical values. In order to address important research questions, the first step is that observations need to be quantified. That is, there needs to be some well-specified method for assigning numerical values to things, or a systematic way of classifying things into groups. In the example we just looked at, nothing was quantified, so we could not even begin to address important research questions. Now, if things had been quantified, one of the very first questions to address pertains to assessment validity. Recall that assessment validity pertains to whether or not an assessment instrument is measuring the thing it is supposed to be measuring. And one of the problems we have seen throughout history is that when practitioners evaluate the effectiveness of their own work, they are usually confident that their treatments are effective, and they usually remain confident even in situations where their treatments are not effective and even when their treatments are harmful. For example, we saw this with the history of bloodletting. We saw how for a few thousand years, physicians were confident that bloodletting was an effective treatment. So in the case of leucotomies, if we had had numerical ratings of different symptoms, well, if we had that, we could then test the validity of those ratings. For example, we could use Spearman's factor analysis to determine how many different types or how many different dimensions of patient symptoms and outcomes need to be assessed to get a valid picture of a patient's outcome. And we could use Pearson's correlation to determine if ratings provided by a practitioner actually correlate with other meaningful outcomes. And this would tell us whether the practitioner ratings captured all the important outcomes and whether the practitioner ratings were meaningful or bogus. In the case of lobotomies, this type of analysis would have brought to light major problems with assessment validity. This type of analysis would probably have shown us that the practitioner ratings were essentially meaningless. The key problem with this research was that the assessments were not valid. The practitioners, like all humans, and we know this, humans do this, we only notice what we expect to see. And so when we get these subjective narratives, we're just getting what the practitioners expected to see. Notably, another problem with the study is that it did not have a control group. To evaluate the effectiveness of a treatment, it would be necessary to randomly assign people to a treatment group and a control group. This was one of the things that Fisher highlighted in his articles when he wrote about studies of crop variation. Many types of symptoms will naturally go up and down over time. So even if researchers observe people to improve after a treatment, if there's no control group, it's not possible to determine whether that change was due to the treatment or due to something else. Another potential issue for the study pertains to sampling error. So with the study we just looked at, there were 3 cases. In the original study, there were 20. So with 23 patients altogether, was that enough to give us a reliable picture of the effect of lobotomies in the entire population? So that's a question of sampling error, and that could be addressed using Gossett's t-distribution or Fisher's ANOVA, and it could be addressed by calculating one of those p-values. So taken together, At this point in history, statisticians have developed some important tools that researchers could use to draw valid conclusions from their results. But these tools were still relatively new, and they were not used in the study of leucotomies. So in the United States, during the decade of 1940, there were two people who played a major role in making lobotomies popular. They included a neuropsychiatrist named Walter Freeman and a surgeon named James Watts. And these two men worked together as a team. They experimented with the procedure, they tried different techniques, and eventually they renamed the procedure from leucotomy to lobotomy. It had to do with whether only white matter was destroyed or more than white matter was destroyed during the procedure. So they promoted lobotomies, they talked with reporters, and they gave lectures, and they made films, and they traveled across the United States giving demonstrations. And the peak use of lobotomies was in the late 1940s. And between 1948 and 1952, there were about 5,000 lobotomies performed each year in the United States. So eventually, Freeman went out on his own, and he developed something that he called a transorbital procedure. This was something that could be performed with an ice pick as a type of outpatient surgery. Now, at this time, an ice pick was a common household item that people used to break ice in ice boxes or refrigerators. And Freeman determined that the skull behind the eye sockets is thin enough that an ice pick could be tapped through it with a hammer. So, a patient would be rendered unconscious by electrical convulsive shock therapy. I'll say more about that in a moment. And while the patient was unconscious, an ice pick would be placed above the eyeball and then tapped into the brain with a hammer, and then it would be moved back and forth to perform the lobotomy. And a patient would regain consciousness and then could be sent home later that same day. The picture on the screen is a picture of Walter Freeman performing a transorbital lobotomy. And the thing that should be especially chilling about the picture is the fact that probably Freeman and probably everyone else in the picture are all people that sincerely want to help the patient. It is a picture of highly trained professionals that want to help, but doing something terrible. Here are results from a paper that Walter Freeman published in 1949. It lists outcomes for people that received lobotomies, and it also gives us a feel for the types of people that were given lobotomies. The first diagnosis on the list says involutional psychoses, and I believe that would have been a term used to describe a type of severe depression. And from the table, it appears that lobotomies were also used to treat people with obsessive-compulsive disorders, and to treat people with schizophrenia, and apparently to treat people with chronic pain. Now, on the one hand, it is notable that Freeman is now quantifying results, and also he has a very large sample of 623 people. On the other hand, this report is still based on assessments where practitioners are rating the outcomes of their own patients. The ratings of good, fair, and poor are the ratings that were assigned to the patient by the practitioner. So the assessments are probably not valid. And moreover, the study does not have a control group. Now, eventually, the medical community would begin to question the effectiveness of lobotomies. Actually, especially when lobotomies were made obsolete with the development of antipsychotic medication, as we'll see in our discussion of the next decade. However, Freeman remained persistent in his belief that lobotomies were effective. He was confident of this for his entire life. At one point, as lobotomies were going out of style and people were beginning to question Freeman's techniques, Freeman produced a large box of Christmas cards he had received from lobotomized patients, and he showed them to everyone as evidence that he was providing appreciated help. Then, after he retired in the 1970s, he traveled around the country to visit patients he had lobotomized. So he seems to have been highly sincere in his belief that he had helped people. In addition to lobotomies, other medical treatments for people with mental disorders during this decade included insulin coma therapy and electrical convulsive therapy. So, with insulin coma therapy, a patient received an injection of insulin to lower blood sugar levels, and the patient would be given a very large dose so that the patient would first go into a stupor and then go into a coma. And then the patient would be revived by giving the patient glucose that was delivered via a tube through the patient's nose. The picture on the screen shows a patient being revived from insulin coma therapy. So that was insulin coma therapy. And then electrical convulsive therapy is where an electrical current would be passed through the patient's brain, causing the patient to have seizures. Usually, medical professionals would have to hold the patient down while the patient was having seizures, and they typically put something in the patient's mouth to prevent the patient from biting his or her tongue. I believe the pictures on the screen depict what the electrical convulsive equipment looked like during the decade of 1940. Notably, this procedure is still used today, although they give patients a type of muscle relaxant that prevents them from physically moving during seizures. One important psychology research study conducted during the decade of 1940 was conducted by a husband and wife team of two psychologists named Mamie Clark and Kenneth Clark, who are pictured here on the screen. And their study is important because it might be the first study that gained substantial attention and that had the potential to move psychology in an anti-racist direction. So the Clark study involved observing children as they played in a playroom that had both black dolls and white dolls in the playroom. And they observed both black children and white children playing in their playroom. And they found, not surprisingly, that the white children preferred to play with the white dolls. But importantly, they also found that the black children preferred to play with the white dolls as well. So their study illustrated one of the effects of racism on black children. The most likely explanation of the results is that in a culture that values whiteness and that devalues darkness, then even children with dark skin are attracted to things that are valued in the white culture. Now let's pick up on our story about the development of clinical psychology. Recall that prior to this point, clinical psychology had been focused on intelligence testing. But, as I mentioned previously, something associated with World War II caused clinical psychologists to start providing psychotherapy. So, what caused clinical psychologists to start providing psychotherapy? Well, the answer is that the war created an extremely high demand for mental health services, and there were not near enough psychiatrists in the military to meet this demand. Many soldiers experienced what today we would call post-traumatic stress disorder. At that time, they called it shell shock. And during the war, military units often found it was far easier to get a psychologist than to get a psychiatrist to treat soldiers with mental health concerns. And then after the war, the Veterans Affairs medical centers were overwhelmed in attempting to provide care to patients they classified as neuropsychiatric patients. In fact, they had over 44,000 patients who were classified as neuropsychiatric patients in need of care. And so these VA medical centers begin to recruit psychologists to fill this need. And as part of this, they begin to establish internships that would help train psychologists to provide psychotherapy. Now, notably at this point, almost all the psychotherapy was based on psychodynamic theories. Before the war, when only psychiatrists provided psychotherapy, all the psychiatrists used psychodynamic approaches to therapy. So when clinical psychologists started doing psychotherapy, they simply did the same thing that the psychiatrists had been doing. There weren't any other options. And so all the experts on psychotherapy were medical doctors. And although there was a range of different psychodynamic theories and different psychodynamic approaches, it was all psychodynamic. In other words, it was all based in one way or another on Freud's ideas. It emphasized the importance of unconscious drives and focused on ways that childhood experience can influence adult personality. So as clinical psychology began to change, and as clinical psychologists began providing psychotherapy, it created questions about exactly how clinical psychology should be defined. Who should be able to call oneself a clinical psychologist? Is there a certain set of training experiences that a person needs to have in order to be qualified as a clinical psychologist? Does a clinical psychologist need to know how to provide psychotherapy? And does a clinical psychologist need to be trained as a researcher? So, in 1949, a group of psychologists met at Colorado University in Boulder, Colorado, to hash out these questions and come to a consensus. And notably, the location of this meeting seems especially relevant to me because Boulder is the city where I grew up. So this meeting was led by a psychologist named David Shakow, and on the screen is a picture of the committee in Boulder. And I think I recognize the spot where this picture was taken. And maybe somewhat remarkably, this committee came to an agreement on exactly how clinical psychology should be defined and on how clinical psychology graduate programs should be accredited. Their model was called the Scientist Practitioner Model, or sometimes it's simply referred to as the Boulder Model. And so, according to this model, a clinical psychologist needs to be trained as a scientist and to receive a doctoral degree in psychology, and a psychologist also needs to be trained as a practitioner. And part of their model included the requirement that clinical psychologists need to have clinical practicum experiences while they are completing their doctoral work. And then, before receiving a degree, they also need to complete a one-year internship. So, based on the work of this committee, the American Psychological Association began a program of accrediting graduate clinical psychology programs based on adherence to this model. And today, clinical psychology students will probably recognize that the APA is still responsible for accrediting clinical psychology programs, and the Boulder model is still largely followed today.
Sights and sounds of fear flashed upon the screens, with calls for law and order and war on welfare queens. 5 grams would get
So, as I mentioned, in the decade of 1940, almost all forms of psychotherapy were psychodynamic. However, many different varieties of psychodynamic theory were emerging. In general, psychodynamic theory was the type of theory that made it easy for psychiatrists to break into factions and to form splinter groups. This is because many of the tenets of Freud's theory and of psychodynamic theories in general are all things that need to be taken on faith. The basic concepts behind psychodynamic theories are ideas that are not really based on scientific observation, but rather ideas that are based on the authority and the expertise of the person proposing the idea. For example, a therapist might conclude that a client's anxiety is caused by an unconscious drive. Or a therapist might conclude that a client's anxiety is caused by a traumatic childhood experience that the client has since repressed. These are not hypotheses that can be tested. If a client agrees with the interpretation, the client would be considered to be insightful. If the client disagrees with the interpretation, the client would be considered to be resistant. But there's nothing that would disprove the hypothesis. In other words, psychodynamic theories were largely based on a type of circular reasoning that cannot be disproved. So, with no way to disprove the theories, more and more psychodynamic experts came up with more and more variants of psychodynamic theory. And one popular type of psychodynamic theory was something called interpersonal psychoanalysis. And a key person to develop interpersonal psychoanalysis was an American psychiatrist named Harry Stack Sullivan, who is pictured here on the screen. So Sullivan grew up on a farm in New York, and he was a child of parents who were Catholic Irish immigrants. And this would have been a time when there were anti-Irish and anti-Catholic views were quite common. So he probably experienced some degree of discrimination due to his Irish and Catholic background. In addition, although this would be before the time in history when people identify themselves as having a specific sexual orientation, if Sullivan lived today, he probably would have identified as gay. He lived for 22 years with another man who was much younger than himself, and that he always referred to as his, quote, foster son. And so Sullivan ran a hospital ward to treat people with schizophrenia. And according to some reports, the workers were almost all gay men. I'm curious if at this time in history, gay men might have been drawn to the profession of psychiatric nursing. This is pure speculation on my part, but it seems possible that gay men might have been more willing than other men at the time to become a nurse, and they might have been more willing than nurses at that time to deal with the types of uncomfortable situations that might occur in a psychiatric hospital. Given that people at this time did not talk about sexual orientation, I don't know if it's possible to know the actual history on this, but it's something I ponder or speculate about. So anyway, Sullivan was like Freud in that he thought people have unconscious drives. But he differed from Freud on whether these drives were primarily sexual in nature. So where Freud emphasized the libido or a sexual drive, Sullivan focused on the importance of interpersonal relationships. And in this context, he believed that there are two basic drives that people experience. The first is a drive for security in interpersonal relationships, and the second is a drive for satisfaction in interpersonal relationships. So in contrast to Freud's libido or Freud's sexual drive, Sullivan proposed that people have drives for security and satisfaction. And Sullivan also proposed that people develop a concept of self. And the concept of oneself is a system that includes three things. It includes a definition of what is the good me, and the bad me, and the not me. So in other words, my concept of who I am, my concept of myself, would include some parts that are the good parts of me, some parts that are the bad parts of me, and other things that I label as, well, that's not me. And also, consistent with other psychodynamic theories, Sullivan believed that childhood experiences can shape later adult anxieties. And according to Sullivan, there are two key sources of anxiety, and both of them actually come from a child's interactions with his or her mother. So first, a child can learn to feel anxious by experiencing empathy for an anxious mother. And second, a child can also experience anxiety over fear of a mother's disapproval. In other words, anxious mothers and disapproving mothers cause anxious children. Now, notably, as we will see with many of the psychiatrists of this time, Sullivan focused on treating people with schizophrenia. Today, schizophrenia is treated primarily through medication, and if psychotherapy is used, it is used as a supplement to medication and not the primary treatment. But at this time in history, many psychiatrists were developing forms of psychoanalysis and forms of psychotherapy for treating schizophrenia. On the one hand, none of these treatments were likely to have been effective. On the other hand, it was certainly less harmful than lobotomies. Another person to develop a type of interpersonal psychoanalysis was Frieda Fromm-Reichmann. So she was born to a Jewish family in Germany, and she became a medical doctor and received training to do Freudian psychoanalysis. And then during World War II, she was among the fortunate Jewish people who were able to escape from Germany, and eventually she immigrated to the United States. Notably, her hyphenated last name includes the name Fromm. And this is because at one point she was married to Erich Fromm, who was also a famous psychoanalytic person. Now, one of the rather unfortunate ideas that she proposed was the concept of a schizophrenogenic mother. So, like other psychiatrists, she had considerable experience working with families that had a child diagnosed with schizophrenia. And based on her extensive clinical observations, she came to the conclusion that a particular type of mother tends to produce schizophrenia in their children. Specifically, this schizophrenic mother is a domineering, aggressive, rejecting, and insecure woman who is married to a passive husband. And so this was based on her clinical experience and not really on any kind of objective research. And it probably is another example of how people tend to notice things that confirm their beliefs. We humans naturally detect patterns and correlations, and we often naturally detect patterns and correlations between things that are actually entirely random. So, after noticing one family with a domineering mother, it would be quite natural for her to start noticing every time another family fit the pattern, and to fail to notice situations where families didn't fit the pattern. Now, this theory could have been tested using the new statistical tools that have been recently developed. But at this time in history, psychodynamic theorists generally did not use statistics. And her theory is unfortunate because it blames mothers for their child's schizophrenia. Although symptoms of schizophrenia can sometimes be exacerbated by family conflict, it certainly is not caused by a schizophrenic mother. This is simply a terrible guilt to place on a parent, to blame a parent for their child's illness, which they did not cause. Moreover, although Fromm-Reichmann was a woman, her theory perpetuates a sexist viewpoint because it primarily blames mothers and largely absolves fathers of their parental responsibility.
Growing wide, and the frightening types of people were safely locked inside. Now privileged fingers press the scales with ears to
Another type of psychodynamic theory that was becoming popular during the decade of 1940 was object relations theory. Now note that in Freudian theory, an object is simply the target of a drive, which means that an object is just another word for a significant person in one's life. So in Freudian theory, parents, children, and close friends are all objects because they can be targets of one's drives. So object relations theory is a theory focusing on how we relate to the significant people in our lives. And a key person in the development of object relations theory was a woman named Melanie Klein. And she was born in Vienna to a middle-class Jewish family, and she wanted to attend medical school, but she was never able to. And then apparently she had a very unhappy marriage that ended in a divorce. And then sometime during the decade of 1910, which would have been about 10 years after the picture on the screen was taken, she began to receive psychoanalysis. And then she began to receive training in how to do psychoanalysis, and she received this training from some of Freud's famous followers. And then, after that, she began pursuing a rather unique task of psychoanalyzing her own children. So notably, her credentials were entirely based on the fact that she received training from some well-respected and famous psychoanalysts. But she was not a medical doctor. She was never able to go to medical school, and she never even received a university degree. Now, at some point, around 1920, she moved to London. So although she was Jewish, and she had been living in areas that would eventually be taken over by the Nazis, she was already in London well ahead of World War II. And here's another picture of Melanie Klein from later in her life. And Melanie Klein is the person that is probably most responsible for developing what would become play therapy with children. Now, her theory emphasized the experience of infants during the very first year of life. And according to Klein's object relations theory, an infant feels powerless, and an infant simultaneously wishes to destroy its mother's breast, but is also afraid of being destroyed by its mother. As a result, an infant will develop concepts for the good mother and the bad mother. In other words, the infant will internalize two different versions of its mother. And these internalizations then become important in shaping a person's personality. Now, one of Klein's more interesting concepts is something she called projective identification. And this is a kind of defense mechanism that has many components. First, a person projects an unacceptable part of oneself onto another person. In other words, if there's something I don't like about myself, I view someone else as having that bad trait. Then the person induces the other to act according to the projection. In other words, I do things that encourage the other person to display that bad trait. Then, finally, the person identifies with the other who is displaying the bad trait. So, for example, if I don't like the way I am short-tempered, I might view someone else as being short-tempered, then I will induce that other person to become short-tempered, and then I will identify with that short-tempered person. Taken together, this whole process is called projective identification. And given that this whole process is presumed to take place subconsciously, it is another example of a theory that would be hard to test or disprove. Now, like I said, notably Melanie Klein is most noted for her work with children, and she developed a form of non-directive play therapy that was intended to uncover children's unconscious motivations. So a therapist would invite a child to spend time playing in a playroom that was equipped with toys that would allow the child to act out his or her fantasies and wishes. And this was the beginning of play therapy. Another person that contributed to object relations theory was a Scottish psychiatrist named Ronald Fairbairn. And Fairbairn took Melanie Klein's ideas and expanded on them. Now, whereas Sigmund Freud said that people seek objects to gratify desires, Fairbairn said that people seek objects for the purpose of forming interpersonal relationships. In other words, forming a relationship was the goal and not merely a means to gratification. And Fairbairn's theory focused on how people internalize objects. And internalizing an object simply means to hold a mental representation of an object, or in other words, to hold a mental representation of another person. For example, if I think about another person, or imagine how that other person would respond to me, or think about what that other person might say, I am internalizing that person. Or to use the psychodynamic terminology, I am internalizing the object. And one of Fairbairn's more interesting ideas was something he called splitting. Now, essentially, splitting is a type of defense mechanism where the good parts of an object are separated from the bad parts of an object. So, for example, a little girl might see only the good parts of her mother, or she might only see the bad parts of her mother, but the good parts and the bad parts are separated, so they are never seen together. In this case, the girl might flip back and forth between sometimes seeing her mother as perfect and other times seeing her as terrible. Notably, this idea of splitting would later play a role in the theoretical ideas about something called borderline personality disorder. So, taken together, if you were a clinical psychology graduate student during the 1940s, or even over the next several decades, your training in psychotherapy would probably include reading books by these psychodynamic therapists. For many years, names like Harry Stack Sullivan and Frieda Fromm-Reichmann and Melanie Klein and Ronald Fairbairn, these would be names that all clinical psychologists talked about and recognized. So, as we've seen, in the decade of 1940, clinical psychologists began doing psychotherapy, and their approach to therapy was psychodynamic. Their approach was based on theories developed by psychiatrists and not theories developed by other clinical psychologists. This makes sense given that clinical psychologists were brand new to providing psychotherapy. At this time, all the experts were psychiatrists. However, it was also during the decade of 1940 that Carl Rogers, the psychologist, began developing his approach to psychotherapy, and his approach could be considered the first major approach to psychotherapy that was proposed by an actual psychologist. And if you recall where we left him last, Carl Rogers had just published a book titled The Clinical Treatment of the Problem Child, and he was hoping that this book would help establish his credentials to become the director of a new child guidance center in Rochester, New York. Well, as it turned out, the book was highly effective in bolstering his credentials, and instead of merely becoming the director of a child guidance center, Rogers was offered a full professor position at Ohio State University. So, Carl Rogers moved to Ohio and began his academic career. And at the university, his work shifted from treating children at a child guidance center to treating students at the University Counseling Center. Recall that at this time, universities were beginning to establish university counseling centers, and this is a place where psychologists sometimes worked. And Carl Rogers was highly popular among the graduate students at Ohio State, but he appears to have had very tense relationships with the other faculty members at the department. Given that Rogers came without any previous experience working at a university, other faculty members may have expected him to take the role of a new faculty member and to show some deference to the more senior members. And Carl Rogers appears to have felt that he was not getting the respect that he deserved. So, while Rogers is at Ohio State, he takes his first steps towards describing his own new approach to therapy, which at that time he called a non-directive approach to therapy. I previously mentioned that the very first article in Journal of Consulting Psychology to use the word therapy was an article written by Carl Rogers. Specifically, in 1940, he published an article titled The Process of Therapy. And this in this article, Rogers describes some of the foundational ideas that would become his model of psychotherapy, a type of therapy that he would call his non-directive therapy. And so this included, one thing was the importance of a therapist establishing rapport with the client. And another thing was the importance of the client's free expression of thoughts and feelings during therapy. And the third thing he proposed was the idea that growth comes from inside the client. So those were some of the basic ideas for his non-directive approach to therapy. And also, in 1940, shortly after Rogers arrived at Ohio State, something happened that I call his University of Minnesota incident. I'm not sure what motivated Carl Rogers' behavior in the situation, but it will give us some insight into how he may have been viewed by other academic colleagues. So, the University of Minnesota, they had a graduate program in counseling, and this program had a reputation for advocating a highly directive approach to what they did. I presume it is the type of thing, for example, where a student might take some tests and then be told what career would be best for the student to pursue. What happened is that Rogers was invited to give a talk at University of Minnesota, and he accepted the invitation and he gave a talk titled Newer Concepts in Psychotherapy. And in this talk, he was highly critical of the very types of directive techniques that were currently being advocated and taught at University of Minnesota. Then, to drive his points home and illustrate the problems with these directive techniques, Rogers quoted extensively from a case report from an unnamed counselor who used a directive approach. And Rogers pointed out all the problems used by this unnamed counselor. Well, although Rogers did not name the counselor was a known person. In fact, the counselor was actually the chair of the program committee. That is, he was the person who had invited Rogers to give the talk at Minnesota, and a person who was present for the talk. So Rogers was invited to give a talk to the graduate students at Minnesota, and he essentially gives a talk criticizing everything about the Minnesota program and criticizing the person that invited him to give the talk. So, as you might imagine, this presentation created quite a stir. Now, Carl Rogers later claimed it was simply a naive mistake. He said later that he did not realize that Minnesota had a reputation for using a directive approach, and he said he did not know who the author of that report was. He didn't know who the author of that case study was. At least that's what he said. Other people have wondered if it might have actually been an intentional tactical move on his part, something maybe intended to grab attention and put himself in the spotlight. But regardless of his motive, it provides an illustration of how academic colleagues might not have always viewed him in a very favorable light.
Now privileged fingers press the scales with
Also, at this time, Carl Rogers begins conducting research on psychotherapy sessions. Although psychiatrists had been publishing case reports of their treatments for several years, to my knowledge, Carl Rogers was the first psychologist to pursue a program of research studying the process of psychotherapy. Notably, this does not mean that the research Carl Rogers conducted was good research or ethical research, but he was branching into a new area for psychology research. Now, initially, his research involved making audio recordings of therapy sessions. He made recordings of sessions that were being conducted at the University Counseling Center. And at this point in history, the only way to make an audio recording was to make a phonograph recording on a black disc. That is, to record onto the type of disc that would later be called a record. So they used recording machines that would spin a disc at 78 revolutions per minute as a stylus cut grooves in the disc to record the sound. They might have looked like the machine depicted on the screen, which was manufactured around this time in history. And each disc could only hold 3 minutes of sound. So, to record an entire therapy session, they used 2 recording machines, and they would have to alternate between the 2 machines to get a continuous recording. This meant that to record a single therapy session, someone needed to be continually changing the discs on the recording machines, and also to continually brush away all the shavings that the stylus cut from the discs. These recordings were then transcribed, and some were reported verbatim in books, and every utterance was subjected to a thorough subjective analysis. So this research was actually mostly exploratory and qualitative in nature. It mostly just described what was occurring during therapy rather than test any type of hypothesis. Now, a key, very important problem with this research was that it was conducted without the knowledge or the consent of the clients who were being recorded. Initially, Rogers hid a microphone in a lampshade in the room where therapy sessions took place. So, while clients were talking to their therapist in one room, a research assistant was in the next room next door, secretly recording everything that was said onto phonograph records. Now, notably, eventually it occurred to Carl Rogers that this might be problematic, and he later changed his procedure and began asking permission. But initially, this was done secretly without client consent. So Carl Rogers spent about 5 years at Ohio State, but he was not happy there. He had tense relations with the other faculty members, and he often felt like they didn't give him the respect that he deserved. So in 1945, he accepted an offer and moved to University of Chicago. And when he arrived at University of Chicago, Rogers established a new university counseling center there and continued his work providing non-directive therapy at the University Counseling Center. He also conducted a series of studies investigating client change over time during psychotherapy. Each study included only a very small number of participants, usually between 1 and 10. And each study involved simply administering some kind of assessment instrument to a client both before and after therapy. For example, they administered things like the Rorschach inkblot test and the thematic apperception test and the MMPI. These are all types of clinical assessment instruments that were popular in the decade of 1940. Now, these studies did not have a control group, and without a control group, this research was not highly informative. This is because people are most likely to seek help at a counseling center at a time when they hit a low point and feel especially bad. And after hitting a low point, people often improve to some extent naturally, regardless of whether they seek counseling. So, without a control group, this research did not really provide meaningful information about the effectiveness of counseling. But then Rogers received actually a very large grant to conduct a psychotherapy outcome study with a control group. And so he had a treatment group in the study. This treatment group included 25 people seeking services at the University Counseling Center. And then, well, in this study, the control group was actually somewhat problematic because the control group was recruited separately. So to get the control group, Rogers put up advertisements throughout the campus to recruit participants for a study that was described as a research study on personality. So this means that people were not randomly assigned to treatment and control conditions. And this violates one of the key principles that Ronald Fisher established in describing the essential components of an experimental design. In this case, the treatment group consisted of people experiencing life problems and seeking help, whereas the control group consisted of people volunteering for a study on personality. Any differences between the groups would be best explained by the different characteristics of the two groups and not due to treatment effects. So, in sum, Carl Rogers did pioneering work on the effectiveness of psychotherapy, although his research was not particularly good research and he used flawed research designs. Now, it was also around this time, it was also while Carl Rogers was working at University of Chicago, that he had another incident of unethical behavior. This one involved an issue of client abandonment. So, in addition to working at the University Counseling Center, Rogers saw other clients. And while at Chicago, Rogers provided therapy to a woman that may have fit a schizophrenia diagnosis. And he spent a lot of time with his client. Sometimes he met with her every day on a daily basis. And in his later recollections of this incident, Rogers describes becoming distressed because of this client. He reports, quote, "I literally lost the boundaries of myself." And he said, quote, "I became convinced, and I think with some reason, that I was going insane." So he was having a very hard time with his client. And Rogers sought therapy from a colleague at the counseling center to help address his issues with his client. But that didn't help, and his feelings of desperation, quote, "became very urgent, and I had to escape," was how he recalled it. So Rogers arranged to transfer the client to a colleague, but he arranged a way to do this without giving the client any forewarning and without discussing the matter with his client. So he arranged for his colleague to make a surprise entry into the office during his next therapy session. So, without any forewarning to the client, in the middle of a therapy session, Rogers' colleague walks in, and Rogers introduces the colleague to the client, and Rogers says, "This is your new therapist," and Rogers immediately walked out. And that was it. Rogers' own description of the event later, he said, quote, "He came in, I said a few words to introduce them, and quickly left." And at that point, Carl and his wife, Helen, they actually immediately left town for 2 or 3 months. And they call that, Carl recalls later, he referred to that as his, quote, his runaway trip, was how he described it later. And so he went on his runaway trip with his wife, and they spent most of the time at a cabin in the Great Smoky Mountains. So, even though Carl Rogers became famous for his approach to therapy that emphasized the importance of therapists establishing rapport with clients and validating clients, in this case, Rogers did the exact opposite. His abandonment of this client was certainly insensitive and probably harmful.